So welcome everyone. We're just giving it a few minutes for members of the press and for partners to join. But thank you for attending, and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you're watching via Zoom, and if you're on Facebook, feel free to introduce yourself under the stream. And also help us share. We want to make sure the message gets out to as many Marylanders as possible. So share the stream and tag a friend to tell them watch as well. Mm-hmm. And for those who are watching, again, this event is being hosted by the Everyone Votes Maryland Coalition. We have a few of our partners listed. We may have missed some because the coalition has grown over the last few weeks, but everyone isn't able to join us today, but we all have been working to ensure that you all are able to safely vote during this public health crisis. Again, we're giving it just 1 to 2 more minutes for members of the press to join. If you're here with the press, the recording will be made available for you afterwards as well, but you should feel free to go ahead and record too. And it looks like we've got a good number of participants on, so let's go ahead and get started. So good morning, everyone, and thank you all for taking time out today to join us. My name is Joanne Antoine. I am the Executive Director of Common Cause Maryland, and our organization is just one of the many groups that forms the Everyone Votes Maryland Coalition. Now, this coalition was formed in 2018 and is dedicated to ensuring all eligible Marylanders have access to the ballot, and that applies even more so during the public health crisis. Our coalition is concerned that the current election path is overly burdensome to voters struggling in the midst of this health crisis. And as you'll hear from a number of our speakers today, the plan announced under these conditions, known to us just weeks ago, will be incredibly difficult to conduct effectively and safely under the current circumstances, in these uncertain times and as conditions continue to shift. During the primary, Maryland was a leader amongst many states. Governor Hogan took swift action to protect the public's health by mailing, ballots automatically to all eligible Maryland voters. And after much advocacy, that included in-person options. This approach resulted in a record high turnout, with 90% of voters returning ballots that had been mailed to them. While the emergency response required rapid action by the State Board of Elections and local boards to convert to a primarily mail-in election with some well-known problems, we know now that we have the benefit of time and the experience to get it right, and we should take advantage of this opportunity. Local boards, elected officials throughout the state, advocates, and even many Maryland voters agree that a hybrid election, automatically mailing ballots with adequate in-person option, would be the safest way to conduct the general. And while we recognize that today does not look like what it did in March and April, where many of our businesses were closed and most of us confined to our homes, we are still in a crisis, and we have no idea what October and November is going to look like. 3 weeks ago, Governor Hogan announced that Maryland would move forward with a normal election and mail ballot applications to every eligible voter, instead of allowing for the state board to build on the experience gained in April and in June. That may have seemed like the right decision at the time, but the last 2 weeks have presented us with information that may necessitate a shift in his decision. During this uncertainty, it is critical that he selects a process that will truly provide voters with all options and that contributes to our efforts to flatten the curve here in the state. But the window to adjust the general election plan is closing, and we hope that the information presented today will be persuasive and that the governor will consult with election officials and health experts before it's too late. Today, you'll hear from health experts, election officials, voters who have taken on the critical role of serving as election judges and advocates. For members of the press, I am going to list the order of speakers in the chat. They all will, after remarks are made, we all will be available for Q&A. A few more of our partners will be joining to help answer questions as well. And a recording will be made available to you afterwards. So if you registered using the link, we will send that recording out to you. So with that said, I hope the governor and his team is tuning in today and will consider our call to adjust the plan in light of this new information. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Sharfstein from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sharfstein.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thanks to the whole Everybody Votes coalition. It's incredibly important. I'm going to share my screen. See if I can do that successfully. Hopefully you can all see that slide, voting in COVID-19. And I'm going to talk just for a brief moment about the state of the pandemic and what it means for voting. So what do we know? We know that COVID-19 is a lethal disease. So far, more than 3,400 Maryland residents have died. We know that it's a coronavirus spread by droplets and potentially by aerosols. And we also know that there are high rates of spread in indoor environments, particularly when people cannot physically distance. On the right here, you can see the curve of cases in Maryland. You can see that we went up, we went down, and currently we're going up. Hospitalizations are very clearly on the rise, and there's a lot of concern that Maryland will have a worsening situation. Obviously, we are part of a country where many states are facing a worsening situation, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that it couldn't happen here. Now, what does this mean for voting? COVID-19 poses risks to voters and to poll workers at every stage. So it includes transportation to the voting location, waiting in line, touching shared surfaces, which can have droplets, speaking with poll workers, even with masks. And an indoor location with poor ventilation is of concern because of the potential for aerosol spread. This is from the CDC's recent document about voting. The more an individual interacts with others, the longer that interaction, the higher the risk of COVID-19 spread. So what does this mean? There is a way to reduce the risks of COVID-19 from voting, which is to maximize the number of mail-in ballots. The more people who are voting where they don't have to go through all of those different steps, all of those potential avenues of exposure, the less risk there is for COVID-19. There's less chance someone will, who's infected will show up to vote. You know, I mean, imagine waking up feeling sick that day and having to decide between voting and, you know, protecting people who might be exposed. And what about poll workers who might have to make that decision? The fewer people who have to make, who are put in that position, the better. The more people who can vote by mail-in, you reduce all of those different risks. The virus is hoping a lot of people show up to vote, particularly in cramped locations and are standing around next to each other. But we can beat the virus the more people vote through mail-in. So that's basically the public health perspective on this. It's not too complicated, Joanne. I know you wanted me to go on for an hour with all the details, but I'm gonna wrap it up right there.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sharfstein. And for those who are listening, I think the key here is maximizing the number of individuals who are voting by mail if they can, right? With the understanding that, of course, there will be limited in-person options for those who need it. But more mail means less people at the polls, less people online, and again, helping in our efforts to flatten the curve. We're now going to pass it on to Dr. Latner. He's from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor.
Thank you much, Joanne, and thank you, Dr. Sharfstein, for that great introduction. I'm going to share my screen as well. Oh, maybe I'm not.
Let us make you a co-host really quickly.
Okay.
Sorry, everyone at home, technical difficulties. Rebecca, are you? Okay. You should be able to share your screen now.
There we go. Okay, let's see. No, that doesn't seem to be working. Well, that's okay. I will be. I'll be quick. In following up on Joshua's commentary, one of the things that political science has been clear about, a number of studies using a number of different methods, has shown that the real danger in a pandemic situation is the amount of time that people are exposed to the virus. And so on election day voting, the greatest danger is waiting in line in a polling station to vote. And so it's not actually the time it takes to vote, the time to vote process, that is checking in, receiving your ballot, and submitting your ballot, is nationally the average is 3 to 4 minutes. So it's not even within that time range where the CDC begins looking at exposure after 15 minutes. The greatest danger is being stuck in a long line. And so the point that we need to shift the population to vote by mail is quite clear. But it's also important to remember that even if we provide everyone a ballot in the mail, which is what we should do, it's the most efficient, the least bureaucratic, and the least costly form of extending that option to voters. And we know, again, from the previous electoral research, that voters that have more options and states that provide those options, not just vote by mail, but extended early voting as well, reduces those wait lines on election day. And that's what our real goal is here. The other concern that I need to voice is one of equity, because what we know is that the average length of time waiting in line and the average level of voter congestion is not distributed equitably. That is, the longest lines that we find in every election, whether it's a primary election or a general election, are concentrated in densely populated urban areas, are concentrated among voters of color, voters with disabilities. In fact, the same inequities that we find in wait times and long lines overlap quite a bit with the vulnerabilities that we see in populations from the infection from COVID. That is, the highest risk populations are the same populations that risk waiting the longest amount of time. And so we really do risk amplifying the health risk of the virus if we aren't scaling up vote by mail, and if we aren't moving people away from voting on election day, and really flattening the election turnout curve. And what we should be doing is thinking more about election month than election day. That should be the public goal and the public messaging goal, I would say. Just a few quick points. The primaries, as Joanne pointed out, gave us a lot of examples nationally about what works and about what doesn't work. And so we know that we don't want to be like Wisconsin. We don't want to be consolidating precincts at a level that that creates longer lines. We want to keep as many points of service open. Georgia is another example of what not to do. You don't want to have a reactive local election force, because they get overwhelmed with the requests for mail ballots. Those ballots end up not being all sent, or there end up being errors. And that creates a lot of confusion for voters. And that voter confusion not only is a health risk, but it's a risk to the health of our democracy, because in those sort of uncertain circumstances, people just stop turning out, or they'll go to their old election place without public outreach and the kind of public education that's required to make such a big behavioral change. We'll end up seeing reduced turnout. And again, that reduced turnout will not be distributed equitably across the population. Finally, I would like to say that Maryland, provides a good example of how to proactively engage in the primary situation. A number of other states did the same. Nebraska, Kansas, a number of states took a proactive position Either ideally we'd want to mail every voter a mail ballot, but at a minimum sending applications. But the crucial point here is, again, keeping those points of access as open as possible. And we know that this is a practical challenge for local and state election officials, because you have a poll worker population that is disproportionately elderly. We're going to have to provide local and state officials the resources they need to make sure that there are enough poll workers to work those stations, and keeping as many voting machines per station open as possible within the safety restraints. That's going to be key to keeping those lines down, flattening the election day turnout curve, and ensuring a safe and secure election for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Latner. I think you covered a lot of what we've been saying, right? Not just that condensing polling locations and the issues that are created when there are lines, but how a lot of this is going to unfortunately impact Black and brown voters the most. We know historically that jurisdictions like Baltimore City, Prince George's County, parts of Montgomery County is where we see these issues, and they'll be exacerbated if, again, a shift is not made in the governor's decision. So thank you. Our next speaker is David Garris from the Maryland Association of Elected Officials. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you very much for having me. All right. So the Maryland Association of Election Officials is a nonpartisan organization which represents the staff and members of the 24 local boards of elections. We want to ensure all eligible voters have a safe and convenient access to their ballot for the November 3rd general election. The goal of the local boards is to comply with the governor's instructions for the conduct of the general election. However, as we've begun to implement the governor's order, we've run into major issues. In his July 8th, 2020 letter to the State Board of Elections, Governor Hogan said every polling place must be open for the 2020 general election. However, due to the COVID-19 public health crisis, the local boards need him to modify his order so we can successfully carry it out. The local boards are experiencing unprecedented issues recruiting election judges for this election. Without election judges, it will be impossible for the local boards to open every polling place. As of July 29th, so as of this morning, we have just about 13,000 vacant positions statewide, 12,993. With 4,090 vacant early voting positions and 8,900 vacant election day positions. That's a 32.47 vacancy rate statewide, so it's almost a third of the election judge positions we have are vacant. The high vacancy rate this close to the election constitutes an emergency for the local boards. Unstaffed polling places can't open, and understaffed polling places that try to open, those teams of election judges are going to do their best to serve the election judges, to serve the voters, but they're going to experience long lines on election day. The only recourse for the local boards in these conditions is to consolidate polling places in order to make sure that we have voting locations open for the existing election judge resources. Unofficially, the local boards are currently planning to consolidate around 247 polling places statewide. This number will likely increase unless we have enough election judges to staff our polling place. As the speaker before me, Dr. Latner, mentioned, there are known risks to polling place consolidation, including voter confusion about their correct polling place, where it's located, and long lines on election day. The local boards are concerned about the level of consolidation required, but without enough staff at the polling places, the election judges will not be able to successfully carry out their duties. I should note, Governor Hogan and the Department of Budget and Management have sent an email to all state employees encouraging them to serve as election judges, including offering 16 hours of administrative leave. Mayo supports this decision. Over the past 2 days, we've received almost 1,000 new election judges applications. However, we are still far from our requirements and recruiting must continue. Additionally, the election judge commencements we have today are fleeting. As the public health crisis continues, election judges who confirm that they would work during the election, during the general election, drop out, and they drop out with greater frequency as we approach election day. Recruiting election judges is the most difficult task for the local boards under normal circumstances. In the midst of the public health crisis, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to make up for the election judge shortfall. Speaking to you today, we want to emphasize that this is not a partisan issue. It's a public health and logistics issue. Our goal is to hold a successful election where all voters in the state have the opportunity to vote in a safe and convenient manner. To do that, we need to encourage all voters to complete and submit their vote by mail applications early. We need to get them to the local boards as soon as possible. And we strongly recommend switching to vote centers instead of trying to run polling places or ad hoc consolidation of the polling places on election day. The benefits of the polling places are, as we saw during the primary election, it allows us to open up kind of the super center of voting. Voters cannot accidentally go to the wrong location since any vote center will serve every voter. Voters won't be turned away or required to vote a provisional ballot, and the LBEs, the local boards, would need to employ fewer election judges. Additionally, we also need authorization to begin canvassing the return ballot vote by mail ballots before Election Day. We recommend 30 days before Election Day based on the canvassing time required from the primary election. If not, this will lead to delayed certifications of the results. We may have historic turnout this election, and we need to work together now to avoid the worst outcome: voter confusion, long lines during a pandemic, and voter distrust of the election process. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much again for joining us, David. Obviously, the coalition is just as concerned as you in terms of recruiting, having enough judges to actually work the polls during the early voting period and on election day, and the confusion that is going to come out of all of these us having to condense all or consolidate all of these precinct level locations. I do want to shift to some election judges that we have joining us here today. The first one is going to be Robert, who is a chief election judge in Montgomery County, and he's actually going to be working the polls this general election. Thank you for joining us, Robert.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the offer. First thing I want to make sure, and I'm speaking for myself, and I'm not representing any local or state election board or any other agency. So yes, indeed, I have, during the primary, I worked in Silver Spring there, and so I have some practical experience working during this pandemic. So that's, we'll go through that. Something like that. Let me make sure here. I do have concern. We're here because of November, the problems we have. Running it as a general election, as we've done in the past, just is not going to work. As we talked about the staffing, the problem there is that we're actually going to, for every site that we have, we're actually going to need more people, because we're going to have to do more in managing the flow in and out of the rooms. And that's requiring people that we normally didn't have. It's much more. Remember, people have to be trained for any position they take. That takes time, and when's the board's going to have a chance to be able to do that? So we start with a high water mark of those who've been trained, and it goes down. So people drop out, people get sick, people have lots of stuff. So we have problems. Anyway, on the location side of things, we're not going to, clearly we don't have as many locations we have. It's been going up. But combining them by themselves is likely not to be able to solve the problem. Many of the sites are sized based on the number of people they support. Combining them is only going to make the lines worse, like that. Okay. Now, what's the process going to look like in the room? When you show up, first of all, there's going to be a long line. Practical matter is we're not going to be able to allow as many people in the room as we normally do, following standard guidelines. So that, and remember, we have to count the staff as well as the voters. So you're going to get a small number there. And then with the distancing requirements, we're going to have fewer pieces of equipment to be able to do all this. And then when they get, okay, voter gets in the room, it's going to take longer for every step. Being able to talk through masks and either a face shield or your plastic barrier that are provided is much harder. I did it during the primary. People have accents I'm not comfortable with, that I'm not used to. They speak softly. Speaking softly through a mask makes it longer to get through. You want to get it right. You want to make sure that you're right. So that's going to take longer there. Anyway, and there was a comment about the average time people spend. Yes, most people do that, but that curve goes way up. You get people who same-day registration now required. That is not a 3-5 minute endeavor. We have people provisional for various reasons. By state law, people can take as long as they need to vote. We've had people take 30 minutes, spoil their ballot, and take another 30 minutes. It happens. Things like that. We really do need to push the mail-in amount, and the other aspect is drop-in. Having the drop boxes is critical. Look at the numbers. It's amazing. At least in Montgomery County, almost a good healthy chunk were people who dropped off on election day. So they showed up to the poll and decided, I'm not going in there, and dropped off their ballot. Anyway, if you have further questions, I'll be glad to take them afterwards.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you for helping to cover our general election this November. We're now going to pass it on to Rebecca Wilson. She is a chief election judge in Prince George's County, who unfortunately has made the decision not to work this election. Rebecca?
You need to unmute. There you go.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rebecca Wilson, and I've served as a chief judge in Prince George's County since 2004 in every election, except this one. I'm also a state employee, by the way, and have been receiving administrative leave all along for those elections. Like most election judges, I'm a senior with underlying health conditions. I wasn't when I started, but I am now. So are most of the crew I've served with all these years. Working in a polling place is a physically demanding job, even without a pandemic. Our polling places are open at least 13 hours, and we spend several hours before and after that setting them up and closing them down. So we're in that polling location for way more hours than is safe. It's a complex job. It requires a wide range of detailed skills and knowledge that are only needed for a few days every couple of years. We're responsible for understanding and implementing fairly all of the laws, policies, and procedures that enable our fellow citizens to exercise their right to vote. Most of those skills are gleaned on the job by serving with experienced judges. The few hours of training before each election mainly serve as a refresher or to introduce new policies, procedures, or equipment with very little time for hands-on practice. I don't know how Maryland will be able to staff its polling places without these experienced judges. I consider serving in the polling place to be my patriotic duty, and I love doing it, but I will not volunteer for an unnecessary suicide mission. In general, I respect the way Governor Hogan has handled the pandemic, but I feel that holding an in-person election this fall would be a dangerous mistake that would callously risk the lives of election judges and the voters we serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I do want to note, obviously, Rebecca's story is similar to that of many judges who have, helped to cover our polls for decades, right? And, and rightfully, understandably so, they are unwilling, and some just can't put their health at risk, even with us trying our best to create healthy polling locations. So thank you, Rebecca, and we hope you will serve in the future once things are safe. We just have a few more speakers left. I know that we're running long. Next up is Kevin Canali from the Maryland Association of Counties. Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I appreciate the opportunity today. I know that you've heard a lot of concerns. I don't want to repeat those concerns, but I would like to give you a county government perspective. First of all, MACO represents all 23 counties in Baltimore City here in Maryland, and we typically weigh in on election issues when we think that they're going to be costly or administratively burdensome, and that's because counties run elections on the ground. We are the boots on the ground, so to speak, when it comes to elections. Now, we all know that this pandemic is wreaking havoc on state and local budgets, and counties support our local boards of elections on the ground with significant funding. And counties right now, we're on the front lines of the pandemic. We are spending a lot of money to address immediate health and safety concerns. And at the same time, we're experiencing massive and unprecedented revenue shortfalls as a result of this pandemic. The state is seeing the same thing. We know that in the current fiscal year, they're facing a revenue shortfall of up to $2.6 billion, and the next fiscal year up to $4 billion. So that being said, counties and the state, I think, are very wary of increased costs in any area of government. So we've heard from our local boards that there will be significant costs with the November election, and that's because essentially they'll be conducting two elections, an in-person election, and then they'll be processing ballot applications and return ballots through the mail. And we're talking about increased costs here for personal protective equipment, plexiglass, training, storage, transportation, prepaid postage, etc. All of those costs add up. We've also heard that our local boards are concerned about the administration of this election. You've heard about the lack of polling locations, the lack of judges that are willing to participate. And we're certainly concerned that that's going to lead to long lines on election day. That's not something anybody wants to see. We've seen what's played out in other states, and we are very, very, very concerned about people showing up during a pandemic and having to wait in line, not being able to social distance. So that's a concern. And we know also that they're going to have to consolidate polling places. And when you do that, you have to provide voters with notice through the mail that they'll be asked to go and vote in another polling location. That's another mailing. That's going to cost money. It's going to be administratively burdensome. So we also know that the local election officials are calling on the governor to provide them with adequate time for canvassing. And we think that's certainly going to be necessary in order to get the results certified in a timely manner. So that's very important at this point. Every county and Baltimore City are certainly doing their part to get the word out to voters that they'll need to request an application, that they won't receive one like the primary. So through social media, through newsletters, etc., counties are certainly trying to get that word out and make sure that we're doing our part to inform voters and our residents that that's what's going to need to happen here if they're not comfortable showing up for in-person. And I do want to make clear that MACO as an organization has not taken a formal position on this election and how it will be conducted, but we did have several county leaders ask the governor to go along with Mayo's plan, the election officials, for a hybrid election. And again, that's based on health and safety concerns, that's based on costs and the administrative issues that we feel are going to plague this election if we don't make some changes and some fixes before we run out of time. But with that, we all want and hope for a successful election. We want to make sure that we preserve the health and safety of the voters and of our poll workers on the ground. And I really appreciate this invitation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kevin. I know that we are running short on time, so I'm going to quickly pass us over to Ben Jackson from Disability Rights Maryland. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Joanne, for the invitation. My name is Ben Jackson. I'm a staff attorney at Disability Rights Maryland. That's Maryland's protection and advocacy organization. Disability Rights Maryland is tasked with eliminating barriers to voting for individuals with disabilities. With this mandate comes the responsibility to ensure that disabled voters can independently mark, cast, and verify their ballots. By the governor creating this additional barrier, sending out absentee ballot requests, we are further complicating the voting process without any additional benefits. We did have some highly publicized difficulties in the initial primary election, but these, by forcing individuals to request absentee ballots, this can be further exacerbating difficulties for individuals who have sensory disabilities, fine motor coordination disabilities, intellectual disabilities. There's a gambit of different disabilities that adding an additional barrier will complicate this process and further disenfranchise a population that is already at risk and already turns out to the polls at a lower rate. In the primary election, we had some difficulties with ballots that were requested prior to the shift to vote by mail that were not processed on time. So we already have voters that are wary about the voting process. And there are also voters that cannot vote privately and independently in their houses, and they need to vote in person using the accessible voting machines. So we want to make sure that the least amount of voters are voting in person, and only the voters that need to do same-day registration or for whatever reason need to go to the polling places are in the polling places, because a lot of people have these co-occurring disabilities where they're immunocompromised, they have a sensory disability, fine motor coordination disability, a processing disability, and we do want to reduce the amount of time people spend in the polling places. And we want to learn from what we learned in the primary. I think voting, doing a vote by mail election increased the voter turnout, reduced the number of people that we had in person, and the drop boxes were also helpful. But there were some issues that we learned about, that polling places that have not been used before might not be accessible. And because they're not familiar to the voters with disabilities, they might not know where the accessible entrance is. Because we're trying to social distance and we're using a different flow of traffic in and out of polling places, we heard reports of, yes, there was an accessible entrance in, but the exit was inaccessible. And these are the kind of things that if we dedicated the election officials to doing a mass mailing and making sure that we're doing, to the largest extent possible, vote by mail, then we can concentrate our resources on the in-person polling places and make sure that they're the safest for our voters and for our election judges. There's also some issues with polling signage not being accessible, and the chief judge mentioned this earlier, of having to communicate with mass, and so we had individuals who were blind, who could not obviously see the signage telling them where to go, and so you then need an election judge to tell them. In other elections, you have multiple different judges. You have judges outside telling you where to go. If we're already at this shortage, we cannot, and I don't think we're going to commit people to directing the flow of traffic, especially if you have a narrow doorway. We're not going to be able to socially distance. So, there's a number of issues that were, widely discussed in the primary election. I think we are best served by trying to remedy those issues that we have, which are very solvable, and focus on increasing and enhancing the vote by mail experience for Maryland. Thank you. And if you have any questions, do feel free to follow up with me.
Thank you, Ben. I do want to flag that unfortunately the American Postal Workers Union was unable to join us today as planned, but we do have Ashley Olson from the League of Women Voters of Maryland, who's going to quickly present before we have Reverend Kobe Little close us off and open to Q&A. So thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. So I just want to take a quick moment just to refresh some of these logistical challenges that were already explained by many of our speakers who are professionals in the elections field, and the health challenges that you heard at the beginning of this press conference. We, the Everyone Votes Coalition, see some solid benefits to updating the election plan in light of the increasing health risks and the now well-known logistical issues. And so just looking at automatically mailing ballots instead of requests, it's really easy. It cuts in half the number of mailings that the Postal Service will have to deal with. It simplifies the process for the voters. It's 2 steps rather than 4 steps. And it's smart money. If we cut in half these costs, we can use that other funding to support some of the issues that Ben just brought up now, in terms of signage and support for people with disabilities and other voter service issues, sharing information, making sure everybody has what they need in terms what they need to vote. And then in terms of what we heard from David Garris about converting to vote centers instead of polling places, it's just easier all around and it creates more accessibility. So we are also recommending this authorization to operate fewer but adequate numbers. We know that what we had in the primary was not enough, but adequate numbers for more accessible vote centers that will provide this opportunity for county voters to easily access the vote centers. And I will pass it on to Reverend Kobe Little.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. And I do want to flag before we pass on to Reverend Kobe Little, I see that there's already some questions in the chat. Members of the press, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll start off with the questions that come through the Q&A. But Reverend Kobe Little.
Good morning. Thank everyone for joining us. Those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, members of the media, we want to express our gratitude to the program participants today, and also to the members of the Everyone Votes Coalition, some of whom you've heard from today, others including the NAACP, the ACLU, Out for Justice, and Maryland PIRG. We want to thank our colleagues for the important work that they've been doing on the ground to bring us to this moment. There needs to be a shift in how we're doing this election in Maryland, and that shift needs to happen now. The most efficient, the safest, and the most widely enfranchising manner in which we can conduct an election is to mail every voter a ballot and to supplement that process with limited voting centers and mail drop boxes for early voting and for election day voting, period. Now, we're grateful for the budding collaboration with the staff of the Maryland State Board of Elections. We understand that the governor's office has signaled that they're willing to meet. But the fact of the matter is, for all of the reasons that have been laid out by these panelists today, the public health threat, the fact that the current election plan puts Marylanders in harm's way and in jeopardy, the fact that this current election directive is an unfunded mandate, the fact that we have a gaping hole in the number of election judges that we need for election day, the fact that there are limited polling facilities and those numbers continue to dwindle, the fact that this current process is an inefficient process, and the fact that there are serious equity concerns are all important reasons why the governor must now act to protect Marylanders and to protect democracy. This is a moral moment in Maryland. This is also a medical moment in Maryland, and it requires leadership from the governor, the kind of leadership that he exercised in March when he directed the state to conduct elections by mail. Now, Governor, sir, is the time to make the pivot and to shift from elections as usual to an election plan that reflects the fact that we're in a state of emergency and experiencing a global health pandemic. We call on you, Governor, to provide leadership on 2 points. We call on you to save lives and not put Marylanders at risk simply because they want to vote. And we call on you to provide leadership to save the democracy here in Maryland. Too often, the people who are most at risk in this pandemic African Americans, and Latinx communities. Too often, those people whose lives have been lost and who have been infected in disproportionate ways, too often those communities are also disenfranchised and subjected to voter suppression. We're calling on you now not to see this as a political moment, but to see this as a leadership moment, a moment to save lives in Maryland and a moment to strengthen our democracy. Now, to those of you who are listening, whether you're a member of one of the groups that are represented in the Everyone Votes Maryland Coalition, or if you're just a concerned voter, we're asking everyone in Maryland to do their very best to apply for a ballot so that you can vote by mail. In the event that the governor does pivot, then you won't have to apply. But in the meantime, we're asking you, go online to the State Board of Election website and apply for a mail ballot. If you receive an application for a mail ballot, please fill out that ballot and return it so that you can have a ballot delivered to your home and you can safely make your choices for the November election and return that ballot without putting yourself, other voters, or poll workers at risk for the spread of the coronavirus. I want to, before we close, just give a special thanks to Joanne Antoine and Common Cause Maryland for the outstanding leadership and coordination that Joanne and the organization have provided over these very many months. This has been a very difficult and stressful time. And Joanne has exhibited leadership in the ways that we hope to see the governor of Maryland exhibit leadership. Thanks again to all of you who have joined us for this press conference. We did see that there are some questions, and I'll lead off by answering the question posed by Dominique from the radio station. The question is, how do we get young people to sign up and become poll judges? Well, first, anyone who's interested in working the elections can visit the State Board of Election website, and there's a link there that says how you can become a poll judge or a poll worker. You can also reach out to your local Board of Election and express an interest in being a poll worker. But a word about vulnerable populations. When this pandemic started, we knew that people with pre-existing health conditions were at risk. We knew that seniors were at risk. We knew that we had been experiencing the health consequences of white supremacy and inequity, and that put Black and brown communities at risk. But the fact of the matter is that the failed leadership from Washington and the mixed messaging around the coronavirus and how we should respond has elevated all of us to an at-risk status. Recently, we heard from the Baltimore City Health Commissioner that the largest population of people, the greatest demographic that's getting infected right now is actually individuals between the ages of 20 and 40. So there really is no safe group that could rise to the occasion and serve as poll judges or poll workers in Maryland. We are going to have some people who serve that purpose for limited voting sites, but we're hopeful that we can reduce the number of people who are exposed to working full days and coming in contact with numerous voters. So thank you for that question, Dominique. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Joanne for processing the rest of the questions.
Yes, thank you, Reverend Kobe Little, for your remarks. Again, to reporters, if you put a question in the chat, it's easier if you put it in the Q&A or if you raise your hand. I do also want to note that we have Amy Cruz from the ACLU of Maryland and Emily Scarr from Maryland PERG, who's on and able to answer questions as well. So we'll start off with what was in the chat. Dominique is asking Robert, how do you pronounce your last name? I know I avoided saying it. You're muted, Robert.
Yeah, I am no longer muted, in spite of what people like to do that for me. My name is Robert Borokoff. Probably the easiest question I'll have all day.
Oh, and there's more questions for you. I apologize. And you're asked, how many elections have you run? How old are you again, if you're comfortable sharing?
This is my third cycle.
Okay.
And I am over 60.
And what did you weigh to make a decision? You know, how did you go about making your decision?
Why is it? One is I'm healthy. Doctors said they don't think I'm, a prime candidate for, issues. Clearly, anybody can get sick, and I really do think that I need to be out there for those people who have to vote. They're pitched, in person, because it's. I mean, as the other folks have said, there's times where that's the only way it works for them. And we need to be able to try that out. It can't be the primary because we just can't handle it. But somebody has to be out there. Now, the Montgomery County Board does a good job of providing PPE up the wazoo. We got gobs of it. And they've seriously thought about the process. So, that level is comfortable. I mean, it really is hard working, wearing all that PPE stuff in the rooms. I was in Silver Spring. It's a large room. It still gets hot. November's cooler, but it's it's moving around. Anyway,
we appreciate you stepping in again to serve in this critical role.
And then technically, this comment is that technically, I've put in my name. I have not been asked to work it, but I don't think they've figured out where they're going to put people yet, which is why I'm not.
Okay, thank you, Robert. It looks like we have a question from Kylie. I might be pronouncing your name incorrectly, but from ABC. Kylie, if you can submit this question again, because I think it may have gotten cut off. It says, when is the deadline for the decision? So I see the hands that are up as well. But Kate Ryan asks, can you explain what issues there are connected to access to polling places? Again, and this is open to everyone. Kate Ryan is asking, can you explain what issues there are connected to access to polling places?
Are you talking about?
Go ahead. You're the expert on this area.
So, I mean, there's a multifaceted approach to this as far as accessibility. So physical accessibility, are there stairs, but then also the accessibility that I mentioned logistically of getting through the check-in process and navigating that system. But also it is even, more granular when you're discussing transportation and related to the polling places. So, in Howard County, I reached out to their accessible transportation and the boards of elections, and they were able to put together a plan to get disabled voters to the polls, but that's not going to work for every county in the state. So as far as access, there's just can you actually get to, do you know where the poll is? Because you might not be using your typical poll. If you know where that polling place is, how do you navigate and how do you get to that polling place using transportation? Is there accessible public transportation available to you? Once you get there, can you physically get into the building? Once you physically get into the building, do you know how to navigate? And so, once you're there, is the accessible machine on? Do the polling judges know how to operate the machine? Are they able to give you instructions in a manner that is socially distanced for you to be able to operate that? So there is just at every single step, there has to be this kind of fine-tooth comb to go through to make sure that logistically the process goes as smooth as possible. Sorry for cutting you off, Robert.
No, that's fine. And I've unmuted Kate because I saw that you had your hand up. So Kate, if you have further questions.
Yes, in terms of that accessibility, I'm also asking about access to buildings in terms of, I guess, boards of elections. I know that there was some discussion around June 2nd and the coming election that there might be concerns about access to school buildings that may or may not be available to you. Are you hearing about that anywhere in the state?
Yes, we are. And I'm not sure if David is still on because he could probably give you the best answer. But we know that the local boards have been reaching out to facilities like schools, churches, and, they've been rightfully so, right, unwilling to open their doors on election day. David, I'm not sure if you're still on.
Yes, I'm still here. So great question. As of this morning, we have 123 dropouts, which polling places that declined to let us come back for the general election. A number of these could be, they run the gamut from churches, A lot of polling places have been placed in senior centers, and with COVID-19, they're not letting us come back to those at all. And a lot of polling places don't want to let us in unless we're going to agree to sanitize the site after election day, which is a cost factor for a lot of local boards that we've never had before. So that's also another factor that's coming into it. So to
Understood.
answer your question, about 123 dropouts for polling places as of this morning. And that's out of, let's see, about 1,650 polling places statewide.
And it looks
Thank
like
you.
you had a follow-up question, Kate, this is specifically for for David again. Are there counties where recruiting enough judges is especially difficult?
Well, it's a statewide problem. Always Baltimore City. They have their population is, they have, I think, almost 300 polling places. So the city is always needs more election judges. Prince George's and Montgomery County as well. Again, the larger counties need the most election judges. So it turns into a numbers game.
Thank you, David. We have a question from Rachel Carden from WJZ. Can someone provide stats on how much the mail-in ballots will cost if provided to everyone? Amy?
Thank you for that question. And if there's a way that I can share my screen, I can actually share the budget that the State Board of Elections provided in a letter. Okay, let me see. Yep.
They just made you a co-host.
Okay, can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so to answer the question about how much it would cost, the second line of this budget that the State Board of Elections provided in a letter requesting a $20 million, what was it? $20 million budget amendment to conduct this type of election. The second line here, the $5,500,000 number, would be the cost to mail ballots. What we are, what I want to highlight here though, is that the additional cost, it's basically twice as much to mail people applications to request the mail-in ballot. So not only is it extra steps, and it's going to, increase delays and increase problems, it's more than twice as much money. The first line here is just the cost to mail everyone the application. The second line is mailing them the ballots after the fact. And then there's the prepaid postage on the third line, which is the cost of the prepaid postage for the requests. So adding that extra step of mailing everyone the application and not just the ballots is a huge cost here. I think there's also, I think those are the bigger line items for how much additional cost there is to mailing the applications and not just mailing everyone the ballots like we did in the primary. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers.
Thank you, Amy. We have
Joanne, I'd like to just jump in and just add some emphasis to the points that Amy just shared. One of the important things that the public should know is that the decision to go this route of having applications was made without doing any consideration of what it would cost. The numbers actually came out as a result of our collaborating with staff on the State Board of Elections with a working group. And as Amy pointed out, sending applications is really just a waste of $5.5 million. And we would urge the state to use resources judiciously and also exercise good judgment in a way that keeps voters safe. And the best way to do that is just to mail the ballots directly to voters without requiring them to submit an application.
And Tasman, Swanson, Baltimore votes. I think you had.
And to piggyback on that, and I think what Reverend Little just said is really important, that all of these numbers came out after the decision had been made by Governor Hogan. Additional line items in there that at least caused me a little bit of concern are the $4 million for the voter education campaign. It's important to note that the state just spent quite a few $1 million on a voter education campaign for the primary election and the special election in the 7th Congressional District. And all of the money that was spent on that is now made redundant. It's made useless by changing the process. So in addition to now having to spend another $4 million, they've just wiped out the several $1 million that were spent for the primary election.
Yeah, I agree. I remember, I think the number that we spent was right under $2 million. But you're right, we're having to educate voters. Now, again, for some voters, this is the third election that they're voting in with changes, which again adds to the confusion. We have a question from, I might be pronouncing your name incorrectly, but Kylie, 47 ABC. When the governor or the state, when would the governor or the state have to make a decision about not requiring applications and instead mailing every registered voter a deadline, a ballot? So what would be that cutoff date or cutoff time frame?
So I can just jump in and say what we've been told, and we've been told that for it to be easily feasible to do this by the end of this month, they really need to shift gears. So that's why this is really an urgent plea. And I just wanted to piggyback on some of the money conversation. We as a coalition aren't saying that it isn't worth spending this kind of money on elections, but we think that the way that this money is being spent could be better used in other places. There's an additional item in that budget that explains the return postage for the absentee ballots, which we're glad to have if this is the process that we're going to proceed with. But again, if we just mailed ballots, we wouldn't have to spend that money.
Thank you. This question.
I'd like to add a point to this issue, is that unlike the June 2nd primary, which didn't have many other states running primaries, we're going to be competing with the entire country to get printers set up. So it's sooner than later. I don't know the exact date, but there aren't that many printers that can print the type of ballots, the quality of ballots we need.
Thank you. We have a question from Aaron Cox. This question is for David. When you say 123 of the 1,650 polling locations have dropped out, is that to say, is that to also say that the balance, more than 1,500 have already agreed?
1,419 have confirmed. So there's probably about, rough math, maybe 130 that are pending, I guess you would say, pending their decision.
Thank you. And this question is from Kate Ryan. In calling for the in-person election, Governor Hogan was critical of the performance of the state board with ballots that were sent to the wrong address, sent late or never arrived. How confident are you that the state board can manage a vote by mail election at this point?
Well, we know that there were challenges associated with the June primary. We also know that there were lessons learned. Ultimately, the State Board of Election is a part of the Maryland state government that the governor leads. And so you don't just excise a function because it's not performed well. You raise the standards and you empower your staff to be able to elevate their performance. And so given all of the unfortunate circumstances, we believe that vote by mail is still the best way to include the most people in the electoral process. In June, We did see an uptick in the number of people who voted, and we believe that we can have a successful, mostly vote by mail election in November because the State Board of Election has learned from the experiences in June. Now, as it relates to updating addresses, part of what needs to happen, regardless of whether people vote by mail or show up at the polling places, is that the Board of Elections needs to spend some resources and energy to make sure that people update their voter registration. It's disingenuous to blame voters and the State Board of Elections for having outdated addresses when the work hasn't been done to update those addresses. Voting in person doesn't change that reality.
Joanne, I would just, there were certainly problems with the primary election, and I think we were critical, and there are problems with all elections. Nothing can be perfect, and the goal really is to minimize the problems that we face and provide and have enough time to fix them. And our concern is that adding the process of applications is more likely to create additional problems with our election process than avoiding problems. And the best way to reduce problems is to mail everyone a ballot and improve on the mistakes we had in February, as opposed to create a whole new set of problems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emily. And I have a follow-up question here for Ashley. When you say the cutoff, when you say the feasible deadline for this decision is the end of the month, do you mean July 31st? Just want to quick clarify.
Yeah, I was just about to type a response. So what they have told us is that August 1 seems like the cutoff for it being the most feasible, and then the feasibility just reduces from there. So it's not that it's not possible, but it's that we need to give them the most time to conduct this manner of an election successfully, and so that would be like their ideal if we're going to pivot.
Yep. Dominique.
Yeah, the worst.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, just to interject. The worst thing that they could do is to wait to make a decision, because it might seem like there's a lot of time before the November election, but there's really not, especially when you're dealing with a process as big and complex as holding an election. And I'd just like to interject, just on behalf of the state board. When we switched to vote by mail, we did that on March 18th, and our original primary date was April 28th. So in 6 weeks, we did a abrupt change, and under very, very tenuous or very, very, difficult circumstances. So pulling off a project that big, was it perfect? Absolutely not. But I think that the local boards and the state board, they were able to get everybody out their ballots. And if we did vote by mail for the general election, now we have, as Reverend Little stated, we have more time and we have lessons learned to do the cleanup for the addresses before we mail the ballots. But the absolute worst thing you could do is wait.
Thank you, David. Dominique, you're unmuted. It looked like you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. So I guess my question, I don't know who wants to answer this, but when do we typically do recruiting for election judges and training for those election judges? I wonder this because I wonder if there's sort of maybe a thinking about now the way we do that recruitment needs to happen maybe year round, needs to happen in a fashion that makes it easier to have election judges already trained up and on hand. Is that a factor into being able to get as many election judges as you need in a regular year, regardless of COVID-19?
And I mean, maybe I can start us off because it looks like David's on. I mean, historically, Maryland has always had trouble recruiting election judges. It has always been an issue long before COVID. And I believe the local boards do, not aggressively, but they do actively year-round, work to recruit judges. It is an ask when you go and you become a voter registrar, for example. Do you want to step in and apply to serve in this role? And I know many of our organizations, typically as we get closer to the election, try and help with that as well. But David, I don't know if you have more.
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to speak to this. So you're completely correct that recruiting goes on year round for the election judges. And like any activity, the closer you get to the election, the more response you get because the more people think about it. People, the voters, election judges aren't necessarily thinking about serving for the 2022 election, but it's something that we're thinking about in the back of our mind. How are we going to recruit people, keeping people engaged between the time, between the 2020 election and the next election? That's definitely a challenge. That's why I said during my remarks, recruiting election judges is the most difficult job that the local boards have. And it's a job that's going to get more difficult, not just in Maryland, but nationwide, because it's a function that's usually performed by folks that are retired. And a lot of our election judges are unfortunately aging out of the process where they can't do it anymore, either physically. And one of the things that has been so terrible about the COVID epidemic is that it has, the community that's most at risk for COVID has been the community, typically the election judges. So it has really caused a problem for recruiting and assigning. That's why we've had such a terrible dropout problem. And it's one of those things where as people sign up, they will, they'll agree today, and then in a couple days, they'll talk about it with their kids and with their families and their loved ones, and their loved ones will say, "You're crazy for doing this. Why are you going to risk your health to serve at a polling place on election day?" And then they drop out, which you really can't blame them for, because, it is a risk to their health and their well-being. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, David. And we're actually going to
So,
wrap up.
Joanne, if I could just jump in for 1 second and just follow up on that question as well. Dominique, we have observed over the last few years, based on what's coming out of Washington, but also in terms of our work with fair election funds and same-day registration, we know that we have to make critical investments in democracy strengthening and in teaching civic education and engaging, getting our communities involved in the electoral process. And so as we go forward, this isn't an action for today, but as we go forward, we really have to press the legislature to create funding for fair elections and to engage voters so that people know what the different elements of the electoral process are and how they can get engaged. If we know anything from this period from 2017 to now, it is that we have to be intentional and vigilant about strengthening our democracy and about bringing people into the democratic process.
Thank you, Kobe. So we're going to wrap it up. I just want to make sure we catch this one last question from Facebook. Thank you for flagging it, Tasman. So how will newly recruited election judges be trained? Is there any outreach being done to students? And is there any consideration possible for splitting shifts?
So training, the local boards of elections, we're implementing web-based training, so Zoom and webinar for part of it, but part of the training has to be in-house or has to be in person. So small groups of election judges would come to your local board to actually do in-person training on the electronic poll books and the voting units. So it's a combination of web and small classes for the hands-on part. The outreach to the schools, it varies from county to county. I know in Montgomery County, they have an excellent program with Dr. Zalea who coordinates that, where they do a lot of outreach to the high schools. And in many other counties, again, we are trying to reach out to the high schools and bring in young folks and get people engaged in the election process from a young age so that they understand it and that they can, that they can help us for decades. But yeah.
Thank you, David. Oh, sorry. You again? Okay. I do. So it doesn't look like we have any further questions. I have included all of the speaker bios and their email addresses if you want to follow up. It looked like Dr. Latner had to jump off early, so please feel free to reach out to him if you have further questions, as well as Dr. Sharfstein. Thank you all again for tuning in. And reminder, if you're a voter who is watching this, please, if you're able to right now, visit elections.maryland.gov to submit your online absentee ballot request, keeping in mind that having it sent to you by mail helps us ensure that the canvass process doesn't run too long, but use email, have them delivered to you by email only if really, really necessary. Thank you to the speakers for joining us here today, and to Governor Hogan and his team. We are excited to hear that you will be meeting with the Maryland Association of Election Officials, and we hope that an announcement will be coming out soon on ways to move forward with conducting a safe election this November. Thank you, everyone.